Hey again, and welcome to the first actual devlog for a game that I've been working on, Frog Island. It's been roughly 1 month since my previous devlog, and I've been hard at work finishing the new system and editing this devlog. This video is a continuation of my previous devlog number 0, so feel free to check out that one if you haven't already. I go very in depth on the game and the development process. In this video, I'll be addressing some aspects of the last devlog, talking about the inspiration and initial planning, explaining my thought process on how I coded and implemented everything, showcasing a demo of the entire cooking system, and reflecting back on my progress and future plans. There is a lot to cover, so feel free to grab a drink or food, sit back, and relax. First of all, thank you guys so much for all of your overwhelming support over these past few weeks. I took the time to read each one, and I'm extremely grateful that all of you left so many nice and loving comments and helpful feedback. And by a lot of comments, I mean a lot of comments. Before I get started, I'd like to respond to some of the most common questions and suggestions left in the previous video, the first being the change in the day and night system. Many people suggested that a shortened day and night cycle would be more preferable to accommodate more people's daily schedules, and I 100% agree. I'll definitely implement it very soon and maybe change it to 10 to 15 minutes, something similar to the likes of Minecraft or Stardew's cycles. A few other things people pointed out were the lighting, water, and shadows to make the game feel more immersive and less flat, and make the art style more cohesive. I also plan on repolishing all of these aspects in the future, so don't worry. I'd also like to show off some of the UI changes I've implemented to the game, such as the removal of the weekday text, as I felt it was kind of redundant now that it wasn't a real-time cycle. I redrew the menu icon into a lily pad to continue the frog theme and make it seem more like a menu, as well as redesign the button pop-ups to appear at the bottom of the screen. These are all temporary and are definitely subject to change in the future. Finally, I didn't mention this in my previous devlog because it didn't exist yet, but if you guys would like to stay updated on my development process on a daily basis, feel free to join the official Frog Island Discord server linked in the description below. It's full of super friendly people, and you can chat about basically anything and even promote your own creations. Alright, now that all of this is out of the way, let's finally start the devlog on how I developed and implemented a fully functioning cooking system to my game. I love cooking in video games. It's an incredibly intuitive alternative to the common crafting system seen in majority of games, and usually has a unique mechanic or gameplay feature to make it interactive and exciting. I also love food in general, and cooking new recipes in games is always satisfying and enjoyable to see. The reason why I decided to implement a cooking system was to accommodate the farming system that I had developed in the previous devlog. I hope that these two systems can work hand in hand to give players a satisfying gameplay loop that encourages experimentation and discovery. Players would buy seeds and grow different kinds of crops and fruits, and use these ingredients, in addition to other produce available in the shop, to experiment with different recipes and discover new foods to eventually feed the frogs on the island. With this idea in mind, how does cooking typically work in video games? Well, in most games, cooking is seen more so as a small addition to the main gameplay, typically in the form of a basic crafting system where players combine items and ingredients to make a dish. For example, in Stardew Valley, players can cook meals in their house by combining ingredients, but in terms of interactiveness, it doesn't go further than selecting which food you want to craft and crafting it with the right amount of items. In games like Breath of the Wild, cooking is taken to a slightly more interactive level, letting players make Link hold items before dropping it into a cooking pot, where players can listen to the sounds of the pots clanging, water bubbling, and ingredients tinkering, before ending with a flash and cheerful sound cue. It really makes the whole process feel more rewarding for the player and encourages them to experiment and combine different ingredients to discover new recipes. Finally, we have games like Genshin Impact that also offer their own unique spin on cooking meals. Similar to Breath of the Wild, players can drop ingredients into a pot to cook, but what distinguishes Genshin's cooking system from others is that players have to actually cook the meal. By implementing a unique minigame into the cooking, players need to correctly time when the bar is in the red area to cook the meal. Genshin also offers variants of food, such as delicious ones, if players can time the bar perfectly in the center. Although the gameplay doesn't get any more interactive than timing a few clicks, I think it's still a very creative way to add more interactiveness to a game. Now that all the planning was done, it was finally time to return to Godot and get started on implementing the cooking system. The first thing I did was design the inventory UI with all the ingredients that players could drag into the pot. I used a leathery bag design similar to the seed pouch and filled it with the appropriate icon slots. Of course, I also had to implement the actual dragging and dropping of items into the pot. Linking up the global variables of each item was actually quite easy because I had already set it up in the previous devlog when a specific plant was collected. What I did have to do was figure out how to physically make items move around and follow the mouse. When clicking on an inventory slot, the code sets a variable called current food to the current food, which in this case is a corn. I then note the initial position of the mouse click in a vector 2 and create an instance of the ingredient to allow it to follow the mouse's position on screen. This is pretty simple and all, but it gets complicated when the player lets go of the ingredient. When the player lets go of the mouse click, the code needs to check for specific scenarios. First, if the ingredient is anywhere on the screen, it lerps the position of the item from its current position all the way back to the initial position set up when clicking on a slot. Second, if the ingredient is over the pot, then instead of lerping back to its initial position, I would need to make it lerp instead to the position of the pot. Upon finishing the lerp, I reset the initial position and current food to blank so that the system can repeat for a new clicked slot. The next thing I had to design was the cookbook itself. I wanted players to be able to use this cookbook as a handy way to store all their discovered recipes and cook dishes easily. I added multiple pages in the cookbook to categorize the different food types that players can cook, such as vegan, meat, dessert, and seafood dishes. This way, players wouldn't need to scroll far to find a specific recipe that might be at the end of the list. I did a community poll on the Discord server, and the majority of players wanted all recipes to be initially locked except for the name of the recipe. This way, the cooking system would still encourage players to experiment with different combinations, but they would be able to use the name of the dish to narrow down the required ingredients, instead of blindly throwing items into a pot. After a few days of working on this feature, I linked them all up with signals, and the cooking system was finally starting to take shape. Next, I began designing the cooking pot that ingredients would be dragged into. I drew a large stone pot, animated it a bit, and created a 2D particle to simulate smoke rising out of the pot. I added 5 lights on the surface of the pot that would correspond to how many ingredients are currently inside of it. I also added a redo button for when players make a mistake, such as accidentally adding the wrong ingredient into the pot. Once the player is satisfied with the ingredients, they can press a cook button and begin the minigame. I thought of a cool idea to make the pot move up to reveal the fireplace that was heating the pot, and to reveal the new NPC of Frog Island, Chef Frog, who will stand on a stool and motivate players during the minigame. With all of this setup finished, I could finally begin developing the cooking minigame. I started by creating a large fireplace using particles and placing it underneath the pot to fill in the empty space. Like I previously mentioned, the cooking minigame features a timing system where players need to hit a yellow crystal with a moving bar. A successful hit would result in a cooked dish, and an unsuccessful one would result in a bad dish, and give the player an item similar to Breath of the Wild's dubious food. First, I made an animation that would infinitely loop the bar from one position to another. I also made the crystal spawn at a random horizontal location for every minigame to add variation. I then added Area 2D nodes onto both the bar and the crystal to detect when their areas are colliding with each other. If this collision returns true and the player is clicking the Add Flame button, the timing is successful and the minigame is complete. The final feature I had to code and implement was an ingredient tracker, to track which ingredients were added into the pot and check if it was a valid recipe. Currently, as all recipes are initially locked, players will need to experiment by clicking on the Discover button in the cookbook. When an ingredient is added into the cooking pot, it appends the ingredient into an array called temp pot array. In another script, I created global dictionaries for recipes and the appropriate arrays for each one. I needed to figure out a solution to compare these arrays and return either true or false if the temporary array matched an array in the recipe dictionary. For example, if a player wanted to create a dish, let's say a veggie dish that consisted of 3 corn and 2 tomatoes, the temp pot array would look something like this. But of course, this isn't the only combination. The player could mix and match the position of these ingredients to make arrays like this, or this. The array in the recipe dictionary might be one of the multiple arrays, such as this, and return true, but would return false for the other variations, despite them both having the correct number and type of ingredients. To solve this issue, I created a function to match the temp pot array and recipe array. The function first checks if both arrays are of equal size, then loops through the recipe array to check if it has the current index in the temp pot array, and if the count of the current index is the same in both arrays. Now, this in itself doesn't seem too complicated, but what if a recipe consisted of 5 different veggies? The recipe array would look something like this. But when adding items into the pot, it only appends the name of the current ingredient and not the group it falls under. If my temp pot array is now this, the two arrays do not match and the function would return false, despite the temp array having 5 different veggies. To solve this, I created a second function similar to the first match function that would only run if the first one returned false. In this second one, I could scan the temp array and convert any indexes that fall under a group into that group name. What I mean by that is, if the temp array was this, the function checks if this index is in the veggie array, and converts the index to veggie. This way the array changes and now becomes this. Now that our two arrays are the same, I can run similar code in the match function to return either true or false. And just like that, the cooking system works perfectly and takes into consideration duplicate items and items in subcategories. Finally, I drew an indoor background for the cooking system so that players felt like they were cooking inside of a building rather than outside. I used the same foliage assets I had previously created and scattered them across the landscape to make a nice little area in the forest for the kitchen. I'll definitely be updating all these areas with new foliage and terrain, but I'll leave that for a future devlog. Without further ado, allow me to give you guys a proper showcase of the finalized version of the entire cooking system. First, players can plant and grow the seeds on the farm to harvest veggies and fruits. Players can then choose to travel to the kitchen area via the map. In this area, players can access the cooking system by clicking on the kitchen door. When traveling inside the kitchen, players will need to first discover recipes through experimentation. Once they click this button, they will be directed to the cooking pot. Here, players can combine the veggies and fruits they previously grew on the farm along with other produce to discover hidden recipes. Let's start by combining 5 different veggies together and see what happens. Once players press cook and complete the timing minigame, they will be rewarded with a newly discovered recipe, in this case, the garden salad. With this newly unlocked recipe, players won't need to rediscover them, but can instead quickly cook them from the cookbook. In this new but different setup, players can drag ingredients into the pot to prompt a stamp. Each stamp means that the correct ingredient has been placed. Only when all 5 stamps are present can the player press the cook button. And voila! You have now discovered and cooked a new recipe. So yeah, that was about 1 month of game development crammed into a single video. I'm still getting used to creating these devlogs, but I'm sure as time passes I'll get more consistent. Now I can finally check off this cooking system as complete from the long list of systems I'd like to eventually implement. I think it's also finally time I get started on implementing the actual frog collection aspect of the game, because up until this point there haven't really been any frogs at all, so I think that'll be my new goal for the next month. This system was definitely one of the longer and more complex ones, and I probably shouldn't have started off with it for my first official devlog, but I'm glad it's finished, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. In the previous devlog, I mentioned that I was planning on releasing this game in 4048, but I'm glad to announce that the game will be coming much sooner than that. March 20th, 2024. I did some research and it turns out that this date is World Frog Day, a day where all frogs, big and small, are celebrated for their croaks and ribbits. Of course, this date isn't 100% set in stone, and I definitely don't want to create a hard deadline to finish this project, but I think it's a reasonable goal to work towards for the time being. Anyways, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any thoughts, criticisms, things you liked or disliked that you'd like to mention, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear all the feedback. If you'd like to stay updated on my progress with Frog Island, feel free to subscribe to this channel with notifications or join the official Frog Island Discord server, linked in the description, where development updates are posted daily. Thanks again, and stay tuned for the next devlog coming very soon.